content.
You ready? We started? Have we started? Very good. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. I want to today start off where I left off. I left off the last time you saw me here. I was discussing Islam in Africa. And I managed to get as far as Islam in North Africa. We managed to do West Africa. And now this week I'm trying to tackle, if I may, the development of Islam in East Africa. Now, one of the points that I had made that offended some people, and I'm all in the business of offending people as long as I'm speaking the truth, is that Islam in Africa progressed as much as a factor of geography as by the pen, the use of the written word. Now, if you look at the large empires in West Africa, Muslim empires, Mali, Songhai, Kanem, Borno, you could even go further east to Darfur, further east still to Sennar, the Muslim kingdom of the Funj, which we will keep for our discussion on East Africa in a moment. But if you look at these big empires, what you notice is these big empires were facilitated by the sheer openness of the land. The land made it easy for the horse and camel to travel. Similarly, writing facilitated the spread of messages. And if you use pigeons to convey those messages, you have the ability to move ideas along faster. So these two things, geography being the mother of history, and the use of and literacy, were two factors that facilitated the spread of Islam across West Africa. East Africa, you are looking at an Islam, we may subdivide it into the Ethiopia, Somali, Horn of Africa region, and then the rest of the what you call the Swahili coast, from Mogadishu to Maputo, and offshore the Comoros Islands and perhaps Madagascar. But if you look at Islam in East Africa, there's a reason why Islam in East Africa appears to be less, and I'm using these words in purely comparative terms, less indigenized than the Islam of West Africa. And there is a reason. Now I'm speaking about in particular regard to the Swahili coast, because questions have been posed to me. Why is it the Swahili Muslim from Lamu, from Zanzibar, from Mombasa, from Pemba, from Mafia, from Tanga, from Bagamoyo, from all these Swahili city-states along the coast, why is it that their dress tends to reflect the dress of Southern Arabia, in particular Oman? They tend to wear the kofia, which is called umma in Omani Arabic. It's a cap, an embroidered cap. They tend to wear a thobe with a tassel on the front, which is called, I'm not wearing one now, this is West African clothing, this is Northern Nigerian. But last week I was wearing one, it's called a dishdasha in Omani Arabic, it's called a kanzu in Kiswahili. And there is a notion that the Islam of East Africa, your dog is making more sense than you once again. Once again, your dog, look, the dog is leading you. The dog is taking you for a walk. Your dog is taking you for a walk. Your dog is taking you for a walk. My God, you're torturing this animal. You're torturing. Look, he has his food bowl in his hand. You're torturing this poor animal. That bit of inspired cabaret always happens when he comes around. It's like I'm Pavlovian and he's the dog. He sees me and he responds in this manner. Forgive him, I ought to be kinder to less sentient beings. As I was saying,
a typical Christian.
Thank you.
I'm a Christian. He doesn't represent what I believe. You know.
I know. So we would no problem.
Eternal hell.
That's damnation and brimstone and fire and all the rest of it. Yeah.
Of the God that I believe in.
You know, this is the problem at Speaker's Corner, is that anyone can interrupt you. So this is part of the course. I have to learn how to swat these flies away. And
Well, please
It's not in my nature to be so intemperate.
And the Christian God is the God of love.
Okay, we are recording, so I'll catch you later. I'll catch you later. Yeah. So, before I was rudely interrupted, I was talking about people have asked the question. It bleeds into a wider question, and I'll do that next week. The wider question I'll do next week is why at Pan-African events, West African culture is more heavily represented, is more on show, on display than East African. But right now, what Muslims have asked me is why when you look at East African Islam along the coast, south of Somalia, Somali Republic, to as far as Mozambique, why is it? It seems that East African culture is less indigenized than West African culture. I suppose they're looking at visuals like clothing. Like West African clothing has a particularly distinctive look, as the Grand Boubou, as the kaftan that I'm wearing now, the African cap, the zanna that I'm wearing. East African clothing bears a lot of resemblances to Omani clothing. Now, I think it's because the Swahili civilizations, or the Swahili culture, can be subdivided into two periods. But most importantly, Swahili culture, from its inception, always looked out onto the sea. So Swahili culture was bound up with the monsoon winds that brought ships from the Far East and took them back at a certain time of the year in the opposite direction. So Swahili culture was based on a mercantile, maritime, Indian Ocean trade. Whereas the empires of West Africa, Kanem-Borno, Songhai, ancient Mali, the trade of these empires was a trans-Saharan caravan trade. The trade of the empire of the Waswahili people was a trade across the Indian Ocean to as far as China, not excluding places like Sri Lanka, not excluding India, the Maldives, and such places. Some say coins written in Arabic were found as far afield as northwestern Australia. So there was a historical tendency for the Swahili person to look outward. Africa was called the Nika. It's as if you had your back facing the setting sun and your face to the rising sun. You looked out across the oceans. So what the Swahili tended to regard as a place that was forbidding and a place that they knew less about was the interior of Africa, which they referred to as the Nika, the land beyond. So you have to understand the Swahili tendency to present itself in more Arabian terms as a function of facing the ocean. Now, that is not to say that Swahili culture is a carbon copy of Southern Arabia, because one has got to subdivide the history of Swahili civilization into two main phases. And in the early phase, from about the 8th, even some say as early as the 7th century, to the 16th century, the Swahili civilization arose as a confluence of cultures, some Persian, mostly South Arabian, with the African cultures along the coast. And the Swahili culture developed a particularly unique identity and flavor as a result of this. And if you look at the people, you will see gradations of mixture between Arab and African. There's Indian admixture, there's Persian admixture in Zanzibar. The Afro-Shirazi culture claims descent from pre-Islamic, as a matter of fact, Persian settlers from Shiraz in southern Iran. So this is a culture that has been formed by a slow intermingling of peoples that visited the coast for the purposes of trade in ivory, trade in slaves, trade in gold, trade in tortoiseshell, trade in ostrich feather, trade in ebony. And of course, slaves were a part of that trade. They were not a major part of that trade until much later. Yes, if you look at the 8th and 9th century, there was a spike in slave trading to supply the Abbasid Caliphate with labor to drain the salt marshes of Basra. We spoke about this last week. I don't think I need to go into it in too much detail this week. But essentially, the relationship between the peoples who met on the coast of East Africa from south of Somalia to Mozambique, the people who met and intermingled between the 7th century and the 16th century met on the basis of almost equality. There were few Arabs who settled, and no sooner had they settled, they began speaking the Kiswahili language. In fact, at its greatest extent, up to 50% of the vocabulary of Kiswahili in some parts of the East African coast were Arabic words. Even words as elemental, as important to Swahili culture as fish, samaki, samak from Arabic. And once a culture has begun to take on words from a foreign language that are so important to its own culture, you know that a lot of interchange is going on. So if you look at Swahili culture, you will see to the outsider looking in, you think you're looking at a facsimile, a carbon copy of South Arabian culture. But in fact, simple things like the kofia, the Swahili man's cap, was developed along the coast during that period of interaction. As I said, the first phase between the 7th and the 16th century, a lot of what you call South Arabian culture actually developed in and along the cities of the East African littoral. So what happens is, by the end of the 1400s, by the end of the 1400s, the Portuguese managed to sail around the Cape of Good Hope, and now they are sailing up the eastern side of Africa. And in 1505, General d'Almeida discovered the mythical, the fabled Swahili city-state of Kilwa, famous for its wealth, mentioned in the accounts of Ibn Battuta for its wealth and its high level of civilization, which included plumbing and runaway, soakaway areas for toilets, proper drainage, which is an index to a complex civilization. Ibn Battuta, remarked on the Kilwa Mosque, which was one of the wonders of its day, on the island of Kilwa Kisiwani. The ruins are still there to be seen today. Not much has been done to refurbish this historic building, and there are reasons for that I will not go into today. But suffice it to say, when the Portuguese arrived in 1505, General d'Almeida methodically set about destroying the city-state of Kilwa, bombing it to smithereens with cannon. This was a city-state wherein could be found pottery, faience, pottery plates from as far as China, and the gold that they traded with the Far East was sourced from as far inland as Great Zimbabwe, Mundo Mutapa. So this was the kind of middleman role the city-states, in particular Kilwa Kisiwani, played in the history and development of Islam along the eastern coast of Africa, trading with the interior of Africa, Great Zimbabwe for soapstone, tortoiseshell for gold, which was traded to the coast. There, offshore, Kilwa Kisiwani Island, the Swahili traders, following the pattern of the monsoon winds that moved in that direction, they took this trade to as far as India. They took Islam, as a matter of fact, to the Maldives. Islam was brought to the Maldives by these traders. They sailed as far as China. In fact, the city-state of Mombasa in 1400 exported a giraffe from East Africa to the then emperor of China. And this was in 1400. And that gives you an indication of the trade relations that existed between the Swahili city-states and the rest of the world before the Europeans embarked upon their own age of discovery. So whilst the Europeans were more focused on that transatlantic trade, at that time the African Swahili were sailing and trading as far as Indonesia, bringing Islam to Malaysia, Indonesia, the South Philippines, and this was largely due to the efforts of these traders who not only traded, but they also spread Islam. They did da'wah, propagation of Islam, and so Islam was spread peacefully in those regions, Malabar coast of South India as well, all down to the efforts of these Swahili traders. In 1505, General d'Almeida, the Portuguese crusader, destroyed the city-state of Kilwa. From there he moved on to Zanzibar, which he likewise destroyed, moved on to Mombasa, the Portuguese destroyed it, built the great fort that still exists today called Fort Jesus. It's one of the cannon pointing out to the sea to repel other imperialist interlopers if they came to try to take away their possessions. And so the great days of the Swahili trade had come to an end because of the rude and untimely interruption by the Portuguese who were on their way to India. Vasco da Gama, you know the history about Vasco da Gama entering the Bay of Calicut in India, having made his way around the coast of West Africa, East Africa, destroying all those city-states I just mentioned before. And as a matter of fact, it was a Swahili pilot, navigator called Abdul Majid, who assisted him in finding his way to India. The Portuguese also went into Ethiopia, where they allied themselves with the Ethiopian Orthodox rulers and fought against the Muslim sultanates that were developing in the Horn of Africa at the time. These sultanates have a curious history. It is said that Islam, the actual development of Islam in Africa as a whole, started not in Ethiopia. Some believe at the time when the companions went to seek refuge at the court of the Negus, the Najashi, the king, that Islam had begun to spread there. Not much history is recorded of this. However, the Somali have a notion that there's a mosque called Qiblatain, the mosque of the two Qiblas, that was established so early in their part of East Africa that the Qibla had not yet been established in the final Qibla towards Mecca had not yet been established in it's beginning to rain in Mecca, because as you know the first Qibla was Jerusalem and later it became Mecca. And in fact there is in Mecca Masjid al-Qiblatain, where the Prophet in the second rak'ah of Dhuhr prayer was given the revelation to turn now away from Al-Aqsa and towards Mecca. I believe he was in Medina when he was given this instruction. That's a sidebar. My point is, there is a belief that when people raise the issue of Islam being forcibly imposed upon Africans, the Somali are quite within their right to say there was never any forcible imposition. We were not, Islam amongst the Somali was not imposed upon them by the sword. The city-states like Sailah and others, just like the Swahili city-states, had begun to trade along the Red Sea. It's a trading relationship that antedated Islam. As a matter of fact, a lot of the Somalia, Ethiopia, Oman and Yemen, on both sides, on either side of the Red Sea, were the end of the frankincense trail. So the frankincense that was used in the city-state, in the civilizations of Jerash and Batra, in the northern Arabian Nabatean Romanized kingdoms, a lot of the frankincense and myrrh and balsam came from southern Arabia, and it was traded north from southern Arabia, but also from Somalia and from Ethiopia. Also, the Red Sea was the route from which spices from India were also traded through the Somalias and Ethiopia, and on the other side, I said Oman and Yemen, Hadramaut. The spices were traded through this area. If you go back before Islam, you have the story of the Queen of Sheba taking a retinue from her kingdom and in caravans with much wealth to the kingdom of Israel, established by the King Solomon. And that is an indication. When it's described in the Bible, she is described as bringing a quantity of gold, precious spices, unguents, and all sorts of things which are illustrative of the kind of trade that was taking place even prior to Islam. And so the interaction on the East African coast antedated the rise of Islam. The rise of Islam facilitated that trade. It actually formalized that trade. It facilitated that trade. And so what you have as people are interacting with Muslims, but still carrying on this trade that they've been carrying on for centuries, they begin to become Muslim. And this happened as much in the Somali region as which is today Djibouti, Somali Republic, Somaliland, Puntland, as it did along the East African littoral in establishing the Swahili city-states. So I've mentioned some before: Pate Siu, Lamu, Malindi, Mombasa, Pangani, Tanga, Bagamoyo, Zanzibar, Dar es Salaam, Mafia, Pemba, Zanzibar itself, the most famous, which actually is called Unguja. Then, of course, actually the most famous of the most famous, Kilwa Kisiwani, the one I mentioned earlier, that was destroyed by the Portuguese in 1505 under General D'Almeida, bringing to an end the greatness of the East African Muslim Swahili civilization along the coast. Now, why Zanzibar is important is because I'm now going to turn and talk about the second phase of Islam along the East African coast, which for many people is the last thing they have heard and the only thing that remains with them. And I'm now going to talk about, after the demise of the Swahili civilization, the Portuguese had taken a command of the coast for about 100 or more years. With all of the meddling they were doing in Ethiopia and the wars in Ethiopia between Muslims and Christians, the Ottomans got involved. And their involvement took them as far, not just in Ethiopia and in the Somali region, it took them as far as the East African coast, assisting the Omani and the Swahili to evict the Portuguese from along the East African coast. So Mombasa was freed, and a family called the Al-Mazarui took over Mombasa, and so forth, and other islands. Now, because now you have, the Portuguese are no longer, they've been evicted from the East African coast. They've destroyed the Swahili trading relationship. It's still going on, but they have turned that trade for their benefit. So all the wealth of Africa and in the Swahili civilization is now going to Portugal. But now the Portuguese have been ousted. They've been removed from the coast. The people who removed them, the Omanis, now occupy the coast. So what you have is a power vacuum, and that is now filled by the Omanis. The Omanis found the area so congenial that Sultan Sayyid Sa'id al-Busaydi transferred the capital of his empire from Muscat, because it was called Muscat and Oman at the time. It wasn't called Muscat, the capital of Oman. The region was called Muscat and Oman. But he transferred the capital to Zanzibar. Now, by transferring the capital to Zanzibar, you're now looking at about the 18th century. And in this time, the Omani trade was now pulled into the orbit of international trade, which at that time, the biggest trade was the slave trade. So now what you have in East Africa is Omani people, Omani traders, Swahili traders, the local people of the coast, now making forays into the African continent for the purposes, it is said, initially for ivory, then later for slaves. And the slave trade in the 19th century eclipsed the trade in ivory in terms of revenue. And you have a trail of African peoples involved in the slave trade. The slave trade is not a trade that ended with the Omanis. The Omanis themselves, like the Swahili, were middlemen. They were middlemen in a trade that sent slaves to as far as the Seychelles, Réunion, Mauritius, Madagascar, are places where the French had established colonies. And these colonies that the French established were designed to sidestep the abolition of the slave trade in 1807, which was done by the British. The British in 1807 abolished the slave trade. So the British would now post squadrons, naval squadrons in the sea, especially in the Atlantic Ocean, to stop slave trading. They would intercept ships and release the captives. By establishing their plantations in Mauritius, in the Seychelles, all these places, the French were able to sidestep the abolition and of the slave trade in 1807 by the British. And as a result of this, you have the Omani being involved in a slave trade, and that slave trade stretches from as far as Zanzibar, inland through East Africa to as far as Maniema in the eastern Congo. And one of the most famous slave traders of the day was a guy called Tipu Tib, Hamid bin Juma, whom a lot of people like to refer to as an Omani or an Arab, when in fact, if you look at a picture of Hamid bin Juma, he looks exactly like this gentleman here. And the reason for it is Hamid bin Juma's grandfather was an Omani. Both parents, his father's father was an Arab, his father's mother was an African, an East African. So Hamid bin Juma, or Tipu Tib, was 3 parts black and 1 part Arab. But of course, I'm not using this to exonerate anybody, to exculpate anyone from being involved in the East African slave trade. The fact is, the East African slave trade was carried on by a number of peoples. So you, as I said, at the final destination, on one hand you had the French sugar plantations in the Indian Ocean Islands. I've named them Mauritius, Seychelles, and so forth. At another end, you have date plantations in Oman and pearl fishing in Bahrain. That was another destination. Another destination was Zanzibar itself, clove cultivation, Zanzibar. But the Omanis were one element in the slave trade. As you go inland, you had the Waswahili people, another level in the slave trade. You go further, you have the Yao and the Nyamwezi, further into Africa. Different peoples that were involved in that trade. There is a tendency to look at East African Islam and East African history as only the slave trade. The truth and in fact is the slave trade in East Africa lasted about 100 years. It did last about 100 years. It was abolished by the British in the era of the philanthropic and abolitionist fervor. They came and they did produce material to raise the profile of the horror of the slave trade in East Africa. David Livingstone and other explorers spoke about the degradation to which people, the depths to which people had been reduced as a result of said slave trade. But at the same time, we have to understand that this slave trade was actually part of the international European slave trade too. You have to understand, there is an element of the Europeans still, they may not have been British, but they were French and Portuguese and other people still involved in that East African slave trade. To say that it was an Arab slave trade only is reductionist. It's looking at a part of the problem, only one part of the problem. Doubtless, the Omani Arabs were involved in it. If you go to Zanzibar, you will visit the slave caves of Mangapwani in Zanzibar. which is a place where the slaves were kept preparatory to shipping them further overseas. But before you even leave Africa, if you get to the city called Bagamoyo today in Tanzania on the coast, Bagamoyo in Swahili means this is where I have dropped my heart, literally. It means this is where we have abandoned all hope. We are now leaving our homeland, the continent of Africa, to go overseas as slaves. So no one is here trying to exculpate anyone from their involvement in the Swahili slave trade. But there, as I said, there is light and shade to the story. If you look at the kingdom of Baganda inside Africa, you will see that the king, the Kabaka Mutesa, had become a Muslim voluntarily by trading with those same Swahili people. The kingdom of Baganda had begun to embrace Islam. Unfortunately, I say this as a Muslim, it coincided with the arrival of the British, who declared a protectorate over Uganda and brought the Church of England, and to this day the royal family of the Baganda are split into three religions: one part Muslim, one part Roman Catholic, and one part Church of England. But for the European intervention, you would have had a kingdom like the kingdom of Baganda in the heart of East Africa, Muslim, and nobody could speak about it and say it was imposed upon them by Arab slaves or by the sword or anything, because that was definitely not the case with the Suna, whose grave I visited, the grandfather of Kabaka Mutesa, who had converted to Islam. I visited his grave when I was there, and nobody speaks about Islam as having been imposed upon the Baganda, which is the most significant kingdom of the kingdoms of Uganda. There's the kingdom of Toro, the kingdom of Bunyoro, the kingdom of Nkore. There are different kingdoms that make up Uganda today. But the kingdom of Baganda, for which the country Uganda is named, is the most significant of the kingdoms. And as I said, Islam had spread among these people peacefully and without any sword or whatever you traditionally hear about. But as I said, for the British intervention, Baganda would have been a Muslim kingdom today. So you have that sort of development. I have realized that I have not yet spoken about Islam in the Sudan and in the Nile Valley. I have not done Islam in the Nile Valley. I don't know how much time we've done so far.
30 minutes.
People are beginning to feel that if I go on too long, that it becomes too tedious. So, look, let me just do a few words. كلمتين وبس. بالنسبة لتاريخ Islam, history of Islam in the Nile Valley. Okay, now I spoke last week about the Bakht Treaty. I spoke of the Bakht Treaty in around 1652, when the Arabs under Abdullah, attempting to conquer the Nubians, were defeated in two battles. They were taken out. It was the first defeat the Arabs had suffered in history. The first defeat they had suffered in history, and they settled down to a treaty. Just imagine, the first time the Arab advance was stopped was by black people in Nubia. Nubia was a Christian kingdom at the time. The brand of Christianity that they had converted to was the form of Christianity you associate with the Eastern churches, the Byzantine church. So what you have is a kind of Christianity that took its inspiration from the Patriarchate of Alexandria and also from Constantinople at the time. They fought the Arabs, defeated them, and settled down to a treaty called the Bakht. And part of the Bakht Treaty was to supply, some say 360, some say 400 slaves per year to the Arabs, in return for other things like barley and other grains and other things. It was a sort of trade. And as we say, if the Arabs had been victorious in that particular battle, you could have called those slaves a tribute. These Nubians would have had no choice but to give them this as a tribute. But given that the Arabs were defeated, you have to look upon these slaves as a gift from the Nubians to the Arabs, because the Arabs were defeated. Now, Christianity persisted in Nubia up to the 15th century. There was Christianity in Dongola, in northern Sudan, up to the 15th century. But Islam had been steadily spreading, because part of the treaty was that you have to allow the Muslims to enter the Sudan for the purposes of trade, and if they wanted to settle, you should not prevent them from settling. And so Islam began to spread in the Sudan by this way. So after the defeat, later on as we go further south, near the Blue Nile, we enter the kingdom of Sennar, which is, I'm discussing this as part of East Africa too. The kingdom of Sennar in Sudan in the Blue Nile region, it is said to be the kingdom of the people called the Funj. The Funj people established an Islamic sultanate. These are black African people. Down at that part, and today some people say the people in Sudan called the Shuluk, or the Cholo, are descendants, they're no longer Muslims, but were descendants of the Funj, who today the Funj are still Muslim, except that the Funj no longer speak their Funj language. They just speak Arabic language. Now to the west of the Funj, there's the Kordofan Mountains, but skip the Kordofan Mountains and go to the west. We've heard of a place called Darfur. You've heard of Darfur in the news, where you've heard of the Janjaweed and the Bagara peoples, the nomadic cattle keepers fighting with the farmers in Darfur. Darfur is in the west of Sudan, and Darfur it's also had a Muslim sultanate established right up to the 1920s, the Sultanate of Sultan Ali Dinar. So I'm giving you an example of some of the kingdoms. I'm galloping ahead really quickly. If next week people want me to do this in more detail, I am more than happy to do so. But I'm bringing you up to the point of the Turco-Egyptian rule, what is called in Egypt the Bashawat period, when Muhammad Ali Pasha, functionary of an Albanian in origin, functionary of the Ottoman Sultan in Egypt, declared himself semi-independent of the Ottoman Empire. And under Muhammad Ali Pasha, they attempted to create their own empire by nibbling off bits of Ethiopia along which is today the Eritrean coast, and also by attempting to go up the Nile. Remember in history, the Muslims, the Ottomans, used to capture a large number of slaves from the Caucasus, white slaves. A large number of the slaves. For example, in 1250, Egypt was ruled by a people who overthrew the Ayyubi dynasty of Salahuddin, and those people were called Mamluks. They were descendants of slaves, white slaves taken from the region in the Caucasus, which is today we know as Chechnya, Dagestan, Ingushetia, and those areas. In history, some people call them Circassian. They were white people. So for a long time, the Ottomans were also trading in slaves in Russia and in the Caucasus. Now, when the Crimean War occurred, and several wars between the Ottoman Empire and the expanding Russian Empire, the Turks were defeated, and it closed off the source of white slaves for the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottoman Empire attempted to concentrate its efforts looking for an alternative source of slaves, which they found by sailing up the Nile, up into what is today called the Republic of South Sudan. So this is where Muhammad Ali Pasha and his son Ismail Pasha of Egypt enter the picture. And what happens there, while on the one hand they were trying to cooperate with the British, because it gets confusing. Egypt becomes semi-independent under Muhammad Ali Pasha. It becomes semi-independent. At the same time, it tries to carve out an empire of its own, independent of the Ottoman Empire. So you have bits of Eritrea and Ethiopia being taken, and you have the Nile Valley being explored, and where they are getting slaves. All right. What happens now? Britain comes in during the time of to carve up Africa, the Berlin Conference. The British move in, and they establish a strange relationship with Egypt and the Sudan called the Anglo-Egyptian Condominium. So Egypt is semi-independent. It's colonizing bits of the Sudan from which it is taking slaves. At the same time, the British come and impose their rule on them. So it has a kind of a weird three-cornered thing going on. You have Ottoman Turks, Egyptians, and the British. And the Sudanese are in the middle of all this. In the middle of all this, a slave trade is being carried on by the northern Sudanese peoples, like the Nagla, like the Jalin, like the Shayqiya. These tribes are, in fact, the city of Khartoum, which is today the capital of Sudan, is said to have arisen as a slave trading port on the Nile, where the Blue and White Niles meet, the confluence of the Blue Nile and the White Nile. So it is said that Khartoum, the word Khartoum, Khartoum al-Fil, Khartoum, the trunk of the elephant, is the meaning of the word. Khartoum, Khartoum al-Fil, al-Fil is the elephant. Khartoum, the trunk. It said the way the two rivers come, meeting, and then the big one is like an elephant drinking from the rivers. So Khartoum al-Fil. And this Khartoum was a slave trading port for the Ottomans and for the Turks, but the trade was carried on by northern Sudanese people. Some of them Africans, some Arabicized Africans. I have called some of the ethnic groups just now. So what happens is, what happens is that the British eventually attempt to abolish the slave trade, but in the confusion, what you have is the Mahdist revolt. You have a person called Muhammad Ahmad, called in history Al-Mahdi, who comes up and in all of this confusion tries to create an independent Islamic state in the Sudan. And he almost succeeded, but for his untimely death at the age of 37 from typhoid fever. He had already defeated General Gordon. Prior to that, at the Battle of Sheik Danjuma, one of his generals defeated Colonel Hicks. And it is said that this battle, subhanallah, I forget the actual date, but the Battle of Sheik Danjuma was the first battle in which an African country actually defeated a foreign occupying army, European occupying army. The Battle of Sheik Danjuma, in which Colonel Hicks was defeated in Sudan. The Battle of Sheik Danjuma, I'm so sorry that I can't remember the actual date, but next week I could supply the date. So the British come in after this with General Kitchener, put an end to what is going on, and later on the family of the Mahdi is kind of, restored to favor, and basically Sudan becomes an independent country, independent of Egypt, who had wanted it to be their southern backyard, and Egypt became an independent country as well. Sudan became an independent country, and as you see today, because of the intransigence and the poor management of its southern peoples, the people of the southern part of Sudan who are not Muslim, the war broke out as soon as Sudan became independent. The war broke out, which actually went on for over 50 years, and the Sudan split into two countries, Sudan and the Republic of South Sudan. So South Sudan is now today an independent country, but largely as a result of the intolerance and the intransigence of how the Muslim North dealt with its non-Muslim subjects. I should go on to discuss Ethiopia, but I think my audience is beginning to fall asleep. And I don't like this is when I start asking them questions to see how much attention they have been paying. But for me to go into Ethiopia now and to discuss the Oromo and the Gedeo and the Somali and the Afar and the other Cushitic peoples who are Islamized and partly Islamized, and the battles that they fought with the expanding Christian and Abyssinian Empire, I think is a subject that is meaty enough to be left for another day. I thank each and every one of you for your kind attention. If you have any questions, you can ask me after I say goodbye to all the people out there. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
Bless your family.
Amin. Amin. Amin.
This is coffee, but no way.
I don't drink. Thank you so much. I won't, because I will I will need
Water?
الحمام. لا لا الحمام مشكلة الحمام.
Put it in
لا لا
bag,
ما
put it-
لا لا بشرب بالبيت بشرب بالبيت.
Take it in
I will
the-
drink. No I have عندي كثير.
I give you.
شكرا.
I don't need
الله
it.
يخليك الله يخليك الله يخليك الله يكرمك. Sorry, no I can't take it. Thank you so much. Talk to me.
Lord Lugard.
Yes.
Did he fight in Sudan? Lord Lugard.
I don't know. I think Lord Lugard was the architect of the policy of indirect rule. I didn't think he actually fought. The people that fought in the Sudan, I know people like Valentine Baker, Hicks, General Gordon. These are some of the foremost names of the British adventurers who fought in the Sudan. Yeah, Valentine Baker, Colonel, no, English.
McMahon.
Did he fight? There was a cop, Salatin Pasha, who was Austrian, but that's another countryman. Yes, but that's another. But I'm not sure that Lugard. Churchill, as a matter of fact, saw some action. I believe Churchill may have been present at the Battle of Omdurman when Lord Kitchener was just killing people, like mowing them down like cattle. There's a terrible incident that happened in the Battle of Omdurman after Kitchener killed so many of the Mahdists and left them lying on the field. At the night, their women came to identify their bodies and to bury them. And the English troops mowed them down, shot all of them like that as well. So that terrible incident did occur after the Battle of Omdurman. But that was with Kitchener. Kitchener, not with...
I feel
yeah.
ashamed when I see someone know my history more than myself.
Well, you know other things that I don't know. So if anybody has any other question on this subject,
Brazilian influence in the slave trade. How did the Brazilians?
the influence of the slave trade.
Yes, Brazilians.
Brazilian. Well, it is said that Brazil, funnily enough, became the tail that wagged the dog, because it's a very big tail for a colony, for a homeland, a mother country as small as Portugal, running a country as big as Brazil. The Brazilians declared themselves independent around 1820 and called their country the Brazilian Empire, and the leader became an emperor. So in their own right, they were involved in the slave trade, independent of Portugal, in places like Mozambique, which is still again on the east coast of Africa, and Angola. Of course, as you know, they took a lot of slaves from Angola. That is where samba, the dance, and comes from samba in Angola, and capoeira, the martial arts form of dance, comes straight out of Angola as well. So yeah, the Brazilians were involved in this, but that's only for a short time as well. But still, they were involved because they had become, just like how Egypt had declared semi-independence. Bless my brother. Thank you. Thank you. So too, Brazil had declared itself independent and were involved in some slave trade. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah. All right. So I believe nobody else has any further things to ask, and
Look after this.
أنا ماشي.
May Allah bless you.
أنا ماشي طوالي. الله يخليك يا أخي. Thank you so much.
May Allah bless you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Yeah. How long was this?
Can't take over everything from your melody. Man, say it straight. Man, don't listen to BBC. Man, don't listen to ITV. Listen. COE. Man, don't listen to BBC. Man, don't listen to ITV. I don't even listen to Sky YG. I just listen to COE. Man, don't listen to BBC. Man, don't listen to ITV. I don't even listen to Sky YG. Man, just listen to COE. Man, just listen to COE. Man, just listen to COE.